It was a warm afternoon, and the Grand Palace was buzzing with excitement. The royal family was hosting a prestigious event, attended by important figures from all over the world. Guests mingled and admired the luxurious decor, with gold chandeliers sparkling above them and lavish carpets lining the floors. Among the crowd, a young black royal guard stood tall, his uniform pristine and his expression stoic. He had been trained for this moment, to remain disciplined and composed no matter what happened around him. His job was simple yet important: to guard the entrance to the royal hall, ensuring that no one disturbed the ceremony. His posture was perfect, his eyes focused straight ahead, and he didn't flinch or look around, no matter how much noise or movement swirled around him. He had been in the royal guard for years, and this was just another duty in his long, steady career. He had learned early on how to ignore distractions, how to tune out the chaos, and how to stand firm in the face of challenges. But this day, something felt different. It wasn't the large crowd or the whispers among the guests that caught his attention. It was her. She was the kind of person who stood out in a crowd, the kind of person who expected the world to bend around her. Her bright, expensive dress shimmered in the light as she walked through the crowd with an air of entitlement. Her high heels clicked sharply against the marble floor as she approached the royal guard. He could tell she was annoyed by something already, and he could feel the tension in the air. At first, the woman didn't say anything. She simply stood near the guard, staring at him with a look that could almost be described as contempt. The guard remained unfazed, his eyes never leaving his spot, his hands steady at his sides. But the woman, for some reason, couldn't let it go. She stared at him longer, as if daring him to react, to break the silence. "Do you even know who I am?" she finally asked in a tone that could only be described as challenging. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation, as though she thought she was above him, and that he should acknowledge her presence immediately. The guard, maintaining his discipline, didn't respond. He knew his duty. He had been trained to stand his ground and ignore such provocations, but the woman didn't like being ignored. Her eyes narrowed, and her face turned red with frustration. The crowd around them started to notice, some turning their heads to see what was going on. The woman's voice became louder, more insistent. "You're just a guard. Why don't you pay attention to me?" she hissed. Still, the guard remained silent. He could feel her gaze on him, but he didn't let it affect him. He didn't break his posture, didn't waver. But then, something happened that no one expected. The woman, in a swift movement, reached out and slapped the guard across the face. The sound echoed through the hall, sharp and unexpected. The crowd gasped, some in shock, others frozen in disbelief. The guard, despite the sting of the slap, stood tall. His expression didn't change. He didn't react in anger, and he didn't give the woman the satisfaction of a response. He simply remained at attention, a picture of professionalism. The room fell silent, every eye on the guard. The woman, however, seemed pleased with herself. She smiled smugly, as if her actions had proven something. Little did she know, the calm demeanor of the guard would soon become the center of a much bigger story, one that would turn the tables on her in a way she never saw coming. The room was still in complete silence after the slap. Everyone who had witnessed the moment was in shock, unsure of what to do next. The woman stood there, a smirk playing on her lips, as if she had won some sort of silent battle. Her gaze flicked between the guard and the crowd, daring anyone to challenge her. Her actions had caused a stir, but the guard, stoic as ever, remained unmoved, standing tall and firm in his position. The guests around them slowly began to murmur amongst themselves, some with concerned looks, others with disbelief. The woman's expression grew more smug as she looked at the guard, expecting some sort of reaction from him. But he didn't budge. His face remained blank, his posture as perfect as before. It was as if she hadn't even touched him. He didn't react with anger, fear, or even surprise. His focus was entirely on his duty, and he knew what was expected of him. For a moment, the woman's confident smirk faltered. She had slapped him, yet nothing had changed. It was as though her actions were meaningless to him, and that realization seemed to bother her. Her eyes narrowed in frustration. What? No reaction. She muttered under her breath. She was clearly expecting him to show some sign of being affected, but it was becoming clear that he wasn't going to give her that satisfaction. The crowd was now fully aware of what had happened. Some of the guests glanced nervously toward the security guards standing nearby, while others turned their attention back to the woman, sensing that something was about to unfold. But still, nothing happened. The royal guard didn't even look at her. His gaze remained fixed ahead, as if nothing had occurred. He had been trained for moments like this, where the objective was to stay calm under pressure, to never show weakness, and to always maintain respect for his position. The woman's irritation grew. She had expected him to flinch, to show some sign of discomfort, or at least to ask her to stop. She wanted to see him lose his composure, but the guard wasn't going to let that happen. He had been through far worse, and had faced situations that required far more strength than this. He wasn't going to let her antics disturb him. The silence was broken by a quiet voice from a member of the royal staff, who stepped forward with a polite but firm tone. "Ma'am, I suggest you move along. Your actions are not appropriate." The woman scoffed, dismissing the staff member's words with a wave of her hand. But the tone of her voice was less sure now. The smirk had faded slightly, replaced by the beginning of frustration. She was used to getting what she wanted, and the guard's indifference was now unsettling her. She had thought she could easily intimidate him, but that plan wasn't working out the way she had expected. Around her, the crowd had started to take notice of her behavior. The whispers grew louder, and some people began to record the incident on their phones. It was becoming clear that the situation was not going to remain private for long. The woman, however, didn't seem to care. She was determined to keep pushing. With her focus still on the guard, she took a deep breath and opened her mouth to speak again. But before she could say anything, the atmosphere shifted. A shadow seemed to move over her. An official figure from the royal staff, perhaps someone even higher in rank, approached with a stern expression. The room was still, everyone waiting to see how this new figure would handle the situation. The woman's eyes widened slightly, realizing that her behavior might have consequences she hadn't yet anticipated. But it was too late now. The calm had been shattered, and the consequences of her actions were about to catch up with her. The official figure who approached was tall and commanding, a calm yet powerful presence. His uniform was different from the usual guards, adorned with subtle gold accents that indicated his higher rank. He moved with purpose, his eyes fixed on the woman, his steps deliberate as he crossed the floor toward her. The woman, still standing with an air of defiance, seemed to hesitate for the first time since the incident. Her bravado wavered slightly, and she straightened up, realizing that the situation was escalating beyond her control. She was no longer the center of attention in the way she had been earlier. Now all eyes were on her, and it was becoming increasingly clear that her actions would not go unnoticed. The officer stopped in front of her, his expression unwavering. He didn't say a word immediately, but simply looked at her for a long moment, allowing the silence to hang in the air. The woman shifted uneasily under his gaze, her earlier confidence fading as she began to understand the gravity of the situation. Finally, he spoke in a calm but firm voice. "I suggest you leave this event immediately. What you've done is not acceptable here, and it will not be tolerated." The woman blinked, taken aback by the sudden shift in tone. She opened her mouth, ready to protest, but the officer cut her off before she could speak. "You've already caused enough disruption," he continued, his voice low but sharp. "Your actions have been noticed by everyone here, and rest assured, there will be consequences." Her face flushed as the words sank in. She had always been someone who prided herself on getting away with things, but now, in front of the royal guard and all these people, things were not going the way she had imagined. The humiliation was beginning to sink in. She was used to being in control, but now she was out of her depth. She tried to salvage the situation. "I didn't mean," she began, But the officer didn't allow her to finish. He simply raised his hand, signaling for her to stop talking. "This is not a matter of meaning or intent. You have disrespected the guard and disrupted the event," he said, his voice unwavering. "You will need to leave now." The woman's eyes darted nervously toward the crowd. People were still watching, their attention now fully focused on her. She could hear the soft whispers around her, the low murmurs of judgment. It was clear that the crowd wasn't on her side. In fact, the more she looked around, the more she realized that she had become the subject of their quiet disapproval. For the first time, she could feel the weight of her actions. The sense of entitlement that had fueled her decision to slap the guard was slowly being replaced by the crushing realization that she was now the one in trouble. The officer gestured for the security personnel to come forward. A few members of the staff arrived, positioning themselves behind the woman. She looked between the officer and the guards, but the reality of the situation was dawning on her. There was no way out. With her shoulders slumped, she finally took a step back. The smugness that had been so evident on her face earlier was gone, replaced by a mix of anger and embarrassment. She had thought that by slapping the guard, she could show her superiority. Instead, she had invited nothing but trouble. As she was escorted away, the guard remained where he stood, unfazed by the commotion. His job was far from over, and his attention was on his duty. But the whispers about the incident continued, and the woman's exit didn't go unnoticed by the crowd. It was clear that the guard's calm response had earned him respect, while the woman's outburst had only led to her downfall. Karma, it seemed, had arrived swiftly, and it was not done yet. As the woman was escorted from the event, her head hung low, her earlier confidence completely shattered. The royal hall, once filled with laughter and lively conversation, now seemed to carry an uncomfortable silence. People exchanged glances, still processing what had just unfolded. The security team calmly guided the woman towards the exit, but she didn't speak a word. Her body language spoke volumes, her shoulders slumped, and her eyes darted around, trying to find some way out of the situation she had created. She had come to the event expecting admiration, but instead, she had drawn the attention of the entire crowd for all the wrong reasons. The more she walked away, the more she felt the weight of her actions sinking in. She had expected the guard to react, to show that he was affected by her slap, but instead, he had done the unthinkable. He stayed calm and composed, showing no sign of being disturbed. And now, she was the one in trouble. As the security team led her outside, the woman could hear the faint buzz of conversation behind her. She knew that people were talking about her, judging her actions. Her heart pounded as the humiliation began to set in. She had never imagined her evening would unfold like this. Instead of being the center of attention for her fashionable dress or her confident demeanor, she had become the subject of whispers and judgment. Back inside, the royal guard stood tall, his posture still perfect despite the chaos that had just transpired. His professionalism had earned him the respect of everyone around him. The whispers that had once surrounded him, questioning his ability to handle the situation, were now replaced with admiration. The guests who had witnessed the slap were now talking about how he had handled the moment with such grace and composure. They were impressed by his strength, not just physically, but mentally and emotionally as well. Despite the disruption, the guard did not let his focus waver. His job was to protect and serve, and he had done just that. The woman had tried to provoke him, to challenge his authority, but he had remained unfazed. His calm response had made all the difference. The guests, who had initially been shocked by her behavior, now saw him in a new light. His professionalism had turned a potentially volatile situation into one of quiet dignity. The atmosphere in the room began to shift. People slowly returned to their conversations, but the energy was different now. The guard's poise had set a tone of respect, and the guests followed suit. It wasn't just the woman who had been affected by the events of the evening. Everyone had been reminded of the importance of self-control, dignity, and respect. Outside, the woman was still fuming. She hadn't expected to be escorted from the event like this. She had always prided herself on getting her way, on using her words and actions to manipulate those around her. But today, she had encountered someone who wouldn't be swayed by her arrogance. The realization stung. She had thought she could use her privilege to control the situation, but it had backfired in ways she hadn't anticipated. As the woman was ushered away, the night's events felt like a turning point for her. She could already sense that her reputation would take a hit. This wasn't the kind of story she wanted to be part of. The guard, on the other hand, would leave this night with his head held high, his dignity intact, and the respect of everyone who had witnessed the incident. As the woman was escorted out of the royal hall, the tension in the room began to dissipate. The guests, who had once been unsure of how to react, now seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. The situation had been resolved, but the impact lingered. People exchanged glances, and some even murmured in approval of how the guard had handled the situation. He had remained calm and composed, unwavering in his duty, and that had made all the difference. While the royal guard stood firm, unfazed by the scene, his thoughts were not consumed by the woman's outburst. He knew that his job was to maintain order, and that's exactly what he had done. He wasn't bothered by her attempt to provoke him. His training had prepared him for moments like this, when people tested his resolve. His focus was on his duty, and no amount of disturbance would shake him from that. Outside, the woman was still simmering with frustration. She had been humiliated in front of everyone, and there was nothing she could do about it. The cold evening air hit her face as she walked away from the grand entrance, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement. She had expected a simple event, a chance to show off, but instead, it had turned into a moment of disgrace. Her mind raced with thoughts of how things had gone so wrong. She couldn't believe she had been escorted out. How had she let it escalate to this point? In her mind, she had simply been asserting herself, reminding everyone around her that she was important. But now it felt like the weight of her actions was pressing down on her. The crowd, the guard, the royal staff. Everyone had witnessed her behavior, and now they were all judging her. There would be no escaping that. The woman's phone buzzed in her purse, a reminder that the evening was far from over. She pulled it out, hoping for some comforting message or a distraction from the unpleasant reality she now faced. But instead, her screen was filled with notifications from social media. People had already started posting about the incident. Videos of her slap and her subsequent escorting out of the event were being shared widely. The comments were coming in fast, some mocking her, others condemning her actions. She scrolled through them, her face growing redder with each passing second. Her reputation, once carefully curated, was now unraveling before her eyes. She could feel the weight of it, the sting of being the target of ridicule. She had always been someone who could control situations with her charm and power, but now, for the first time, she felt completely out of control. Back inside the palace, the guard stood tall, his mind clear of the distractions. He knew that his actions would be talked about, but he wasn't concerned with that. What mattered to him was that he had done his job, upheld his dignity, and shown respect to everyone around him. The event went on, the guests slowly returning to their conversations, and the celebration continuing as planned. But there was a subtle shift, a quiet acknowledgement of the guard's professionalism. For the woman, however, the night was far from over. The consequences of her actions were only just beginning to reveal themselves. She had no idea how far-reaching the impact would be, or how quickly her own arrogance would come back to haunt her. Her reputation was now tied to a moment she would likely never forget, a moment that would forever be remembered by those who had witnessed it. The woman had barely made it to her car when her phone buzzed again. She didn't even have to look at the screen to know what it was. Another notification, another comment. She tried to ignore it, but her curiosity got the best of her, and she opened it. The video of her slapping the royal guard was already being shared widely, gaining traction faster than she could keep up. People were commenting, tagging their friends, and laughing. What she had thought was a private outburst, a brief moment of showing off, had turned into something far worse. The comments were relentless. Some people found it shocking. Others found it funny. But many, many others were appalled by her behavior. They condemned her for disrespecting the guard, for showing such arrogance in a place where dignity and respect were expected. The videos had been captured by a few guests, and now her moment of frustration was out there for the world to see. She sat in her car, staring at the screen, her heart sinking with every new notification. How had it all gone so wrong? She had always prided herself on being in control, on being the person others looked up to. She was used to having people admire her, listen to her, follow her lead. But now, in a matter of minutes, she had gone from the center of attention in the best possible way to the subject of online ridicule. The humiliation was unbearable. She couldn't shake the image of the guard, standing there as if nothing had happened. He had been so calm, so composed, that it made her look even worse. She had expected him to react, to show some sign of weakness, but instead, he had just stood tall and professional. It made her feel small. It made her feel like her actions had been meaningless. As the minutes ticked by, the video spread further, and more people joined the conversation. The woman had become a viral sensation, but not for any of the reasons she had hoped. Her name was now associated with a moment of out-of-control behavior, and it was spreading across social media, news outlets, and even local gossip circles. She had become the talk of the town, but not in a way she had ever imagined. At the royal event, things were slowly returning to normal. The atmosphere had shifted back to celebration, but there was a lingering undercurrent of curiosity. Some guests couldn't help but discuss what had happened. Had the woman truly slapped the guard? How could she behave like that in front of so many people? And why had the guard responded with such restraint? Many found his professionalism to be impressive, and they couldn't help but admire how he had handled the entire situation. It wasn't easy to stay calm when someone was trying to provoke you, yet he had managed to do so flawlessly. In the coming hours, the royal palace would release a statement, confirming that the incident had been handled appropriately and that the woman had been escorted out for her inappropriate behavior. The palace made it clear that no one was above the rules, not even the most entitled guests. It was a quiet statement of power, an acknowledgement that those who disrespected the royal guard, or anyone in the palace, would face consequences. The woman's actions had crossed a line, and the palace wasn't about to let that go unnoticed. Meanwhile, as the night wore on, the woman's phone kept buzzing with more comments, more messages. Some were from friends, some from people she barely knew. All of them had seen the video. All of them had an opinion, but none of them were offering sympathy. Instead, she was being left with a choice: either face the consequences of her actions or attempt to ignore them, hoping they would disappear. But deep down, she knew that this incident wouldn't be forgotten anytime soon. As the evening settled into night, the guard remained at his post, unbothered by the chaos he had unknowingly been at the center of. He had done what he was trained to do, and his pride was in the fact that he had shown the world that dignity and respect were far more powerful than arrogance and bravado. While the woman's reputation crumbled, his was only strengthened. The following day, the woman woke up to a new reality. Her phone was filled with messages from friends, family, and colleagues, but none of them offered the kind of support she was used to. Instead, they were filled with a mix of surprise, disbelief, and most of all, disappointment. The viral video of her slap had been shared across social media and had quickly become one of the most talked about events of the evening. As she scrolled through the comments, she could feel the weight of the criticism bearing down on her. Her face flushed with embarrassment as she read through the endless replies. Some people had posted memes about the incident, while others questioned her behavior. How could she do that to a guard? One comment read, "Total disrespect," said another. Her reputation, which she had carefully cultivated over the years, was now being questioned by so many. People who once admired her for her charm and confidence were now distancing themselves from her. It was as if the entire world had turned its back on her. At the same time, a few positive comments trickled in. Some people tried to defend her, claiming that it was a spur-of-the-moment action, or that she didn't mean to disrespect anyone. But these comments were far outnumbered by the critical ones. The damage had been done. The video was out there, and there was no going back. She had never felt more isolated. The reality of the situation hit her hard. Not only had she lost face in front of her peers and colleagues, but she had also drawn unwanted attention to herself. She had never imagined that something as trivial as a moment of frustration could spiral into something so much bigger. Her reputation was now tainted by the video, and no amount of explanation or justification would change that. Meanwhile, in the royal palace, things had gone back to normal. The event had continued without incident, and the royal guard had resumed his duties without a second thought. However, his calm and professional handling of the situation had not gone unnoticed. Guests who had witnessed the event praised him for his grace under pressure. The guard's calmness in the face of provocation had only served to highlight his strength, both mentally and emotionally. The incident with the woman had become a symbol of professionalism versus arrogance. People who had seen the video or heard about it were now talking about the guard's dignity and restraint. His actions had been exemplary, and the contrast between his behavior and the woman's outburst made him look even more admirable. While the woman's actions had sparked a storm of negative attention, the guard had quietly earned the respect of everyone around him. The media picked up on the story as well. News outlets ran stories about the incident, focusing on how the royal guard had handled the situation with poise, while the woman's actions were seen as a moment of unchecked entitlement. The palace issued a brief statement, reinforcing the importance of respect for all staff, including the royal guards. It was a clear message. No one was above the rules. As the woman sat in her living room, staring at the endless notifications on her phone, she began to understand the magnitude of what had happened. It wasn't just the embarrassment of the moment, but the long-term consequences that were now sinking in. Her career, her social circle, and her public image had all been affected by a single impulsive act. She had never expected her behavior to have such far-reaching effects. She had acted on anger and arrogance, but now she was paying the price. The royal guard, on the other hand, had not been seeking praise or recognition. His duty had been clear, and he had fulfilled it without hesitation. But now he was receiving praise from every corner, his professionalism shining in contrast to the woman's outburst. His reputation, which had once been unnoticed by most, was now solidified. His name, once just another in the ranks, was now associated with dignity and composure. As the days passed, the woman's social media continued to be filled with reminders of her mistake. Friends unfollowed her, colleagues avoided her, and the viral video continued to spread. It was as if she couldn't escape the consequences of her actions. The world had seen her at her worst, and there was no going back. Days turned into weeks, but the aftermath of the incident still loomed over the woman. She had tried to move on, to put it behind her, but the reality was that it was following her everywhere. Her reputation, once built on charm and confidence, had been overshadowed by that single impulsive moment. No matter how hard she tried to ignore the comments or the memes, they continued to haunt her. Social media posts still popped up in her feed, reminding her of what she had done. Friends who once celebrated her were now offering empty words of sympathy, but the truth was clear. She had lost something important. At work, things weren't much better. Colleagues who had once enjoyed her company now looked at her with suspicion, a subtle judgment in their eyes. Conversations seemed to pause when she entered the room, and when she spoke, it felt like people were waiting for her to slip up again. Her credibility had taken a hit, and she could feel it. She had tried to brush it off at first, telling herself that it would blow over, but it hadn't. In fact, it seemed to be getting worse with each passing day. People were starting to talk about her behind her back, and the whispers only added to her discomfort. Despite her best efforts to explain herself, to justify her actions as a moment of frustration, the truth was that her apology was not enough to undo the damage. No one had seen it as a simple mistake. They had seen it as a glaring display of disrespect. The guard, on the other hand, had become somewhat of a hero. His calm demeanor in the face of provocation had earned him respect not only from his colleagues, but also from the public. The media praised his professionalism, and his name was associated with dignity and strength. He had become the embodiment of grace under pressure. In the weeks that followed, the woman couldn't escape the consequences of her actions, but what truly struck her was the way the guard had handled everything. He had shown incredible strength and integrity. He hadn't responded to her slap with anger or aggression. Instead, he had maintained his composure, stayed true to his duty, and earned the respect of everyone around him. She realized that in her attempt to prove herself superior, she had only shown her own weakness. She had let her emotions dictate her actions, and in doing so, she had lost control. The more she thought about it, the more she understood the lesson she had learned. It wasn't about who had more power or influence, but about how one carried themselves in difficult moments. The guard had proven that dignity and respect were far more valuable than arrogance and entitlement. He hadn't let her actions define him. Instead, he had stood tall, unaffected, and unshaken. And now he was the one people respected. For the woman, it was a hard pill to swallow. She had always been able to control situations, to bend them to her will. But now, for the first time, she had faced something she couldn't control. The guard's composure had shown her just how much power could be found in restraint. Her impulsive actions had only led to her downfall, while his quiet strength had earned him admiration. In time, the woman began to reflect on the incident more deeply. The initial anger she had felt about the loss of her reputation began to fade, replaced by a sense of humility. She knew she had made a mistake, a big one, but she also knew that she had the opportunity to learn from it. If anything, the incident had taught her the importance of respect, for others and for herself. The road to rebuilding her reputation would be long, but it was one she had to take. It would take time to earn back trust, but she hoped that, eventually, people would see the change in her. Meanwhile, the guard continued with his duties, unaffected by the whirlwind that had followed him for a brief moment. He had done what was expected of him and more. His professionalism had become an example for others, and he had proven that sometimes the strongest action is the one that requires the most restraint.